Welcome to the FDOT Automated Quantities Training for MicroStation Select Series 4, Module 3. This video will cover Chapter 4 from the Automated Quantities Training Guide and will discuss the tools and methods for calculating quantities. Let's quickly review where our quantity information is located in our design files. As we discussed earlier, all linear and each elements belong in the DSGN files. The DSGN design file can be in whichever discipline you're working in, RD for roadway, SP for signing and pavement marking, etc. The lines and shapes and cells that make up your design are more than just graphical elements, though. When we place those elements with D&C Manager and Place Influence, or with Civil Tools and Features, those lines, shapes, and cells all have extra quantity information stored on them. We can then report on that information to generate our quantities. For quantities that aren't lines or cells, though, specifically quantities that involve areas or tonnage, we have to define the areas that are enclosed by those lines and curves in our drawings. So for those quantities, we have the quantity shape file, or QTD-SRD. This file is specifically created to reference the design file and create shapes that we can then use to define those areas, so we can calculate those areas or tonnages or cubic yards of material. In this module, we're going to discuss more about how D&C Manager defines this information, how it's attached to our drawing elements, and how we can pull that information back out of our files to generate our quantity reports that go in our plans. To make sure that we're drawing and calculating our quantities properly, let's take a closer look at the settings in D&C Manager that control how this information gets processed. Most of the D&C settings are already configured correctly by default. However, there are a couple that may need modification depending on what elements are being placed or calculated. Let's take a closer look at the design settings and the compute settings. First, on the Design Settings dialog, we need to check the element connectivity settings. The maximum gap tolerance is what determines if two elements are connected or touching. The default is set to 0.5, and it is recommended that the value should not be any greater than 0.2. So make sure you adjust this value to at least 0.2. You don't want two lines that are half a foot apart being recognized as a single element. The deduction tolerance sets the distance that D&C will look around a given element to identify another element that could affect the quantity value. This is primarily used by FDOT for calculation of curb and gutter when there are inlets. Since the insertion point for an inlet cell is not placed directly on the curb and gutter line, we need to adjust this distance to allow D&C to recognize where those cells are and adjust the curb and gutter quantity accordingly. Generally, a value of 3 feet is sufficient for this purpose. On the Compute Settings dialog, we need to look at the DBMS properties. For FDOT projects, the DBMS driver should always be set to MicrosoftAccess.mdb. This is the file type that is compatible with GeoPack's Quantity Manager. Also, you should never set a username or password on your database. Even if you're the only designer working on the project in your office, the project reviewers may still need to access these files, so we don't set security on them. Finally, it's very important not to check the checkbox for Purge Quantities for deleted DGN elements. This would clear quantities for any item that isn't seen in the current DGN file. Unless you had absolutely every quantity element from your design file, all the QTD-SRD models, as well as any other element used to generate quantities, referenced into the active DGN, anything that D&C didn't see in that design file would get deleted from your quantity database. It's just safer to leave this option not checked so you don't have to worry about things going missing from your quantity database. All of the other settings in this dialog are okay in their default settings. Now let's take a look at D&C Manager's Compute Mode and the Quantity Computation dialog and how it can be configured to generate the quantity data that we want. The first thing we need to do is set the GeoPack job. The D&C tool can compute quantities without it, but the GeoPack data is necessary to give the location information about the elements we want to quantify, so for our quantities process, it is required. Next, we set the extents. This tells D&C which elements to consider for calculation. Depending on what elements you need to evaluate, You can set the parameters as wide as the entire design file or as narrow as a single selection in a selection set. The sheet range option also allows for quantities to be calculated by defined sheet boundaries. This method is covered in more detail in the Traffic Plans course. You can also refine the selection by setting the extents to specifically include items that are inside the extent specified, if they overlap, or if the quantity should be clipped based on a particular extent selection. Just as it's important to set the GeoPack job, you must also set the chain. This allows D&C Manager to assign stationing values to the quantities exported. If there are multiple chains on a project or within a design file, that makes setting the extents very important to make sure that the correct design elements are calculated along the correct chain with the proper stationing. Generally, when you set a chain, the begin and end stations are automatically populated with the minimum and maximum values that are assigned to that chain. This can be adjusted, though, if necessary, to refine the limits of the elements being calculated. If you type in a station, you can just type in the numeric value, and it will automatically format it with the plus sign. Also, the slider buttons to the right of the station numbers can be used to select a location on the screen. Finally, the range defines how far from the chain that elements will be considered for calculation. If the range is set to 100, D&C will include any items meeting the defined extents and stationing that are also within 100 feet left or right of the assigned chain. This works with the extent settings for inside, overlap, and clip as well. To make it easier to see if your settings have included all the expected elements, you can set the highlight active and choose whatever color in the drop-down that you prefer that highlights the items that have been computed. If too many or too few items highlight during this operation, you'll know that you need to adjust your settings like range and extents to include all the items you want to compute. Once all the settings are defined for the calculation you want to quantify, then click Compute Quantities to see the computation results. Now that we know how to set the planned quantity computation dialog, we also need to look at ways to include one or more pay items in the calculation. You can set your D&C database selection before or after configuring the quantity computation dialog, but you must select at least one pay item before clicking Compute Quantities. There are several ways you can select the pay items to compute. You can select a single item by clicking on it and setting it active in the database. If you compute with only one item selected, the computation results will only show the quantities for that one item. You can select a folder or category in the database list by selecting and activating it. This will compute all the items within that category if they are present in the design file. The computation results will show the quantities for all items that are present within that category. You can select items from the database and then add them to a collection set, which will appear in the collection bin window that appears below the database list in the D&C Manager dialog. Clicking on Compute Quantities with an active collection set will generate quantities for all the items in the collection set. If you'd like to be able to call up this same group of items and categories later, you can save your collection to the project's SYMB folder. If you have previously saved a collection set, you can right-click in the collection bin window and select Open a Collection, and navigate to the SYMB folder to select the desired collection. This will open the saved collection in the collection bin, and you can compute quantities on that group of items or categories. Note that if there is an active collection set, highlighting an item in the database list will not calculate the highlighted item unless the collection set is cleared. Once you have selected the database items, categories, or collection set, configured the quantity computation dialog, and clicked Compute Quantities, you'll see the computation results dialog. In this screen, you'll see the results of the calculation as well as various options to export that data. For FDOT quantities, the export format is always DBMS. The file name should be set to the project number and can include a discipline abbreviation if desired. The extension should always be .mdb. This file should be saved in the Discipline folder. The file can be set to create or append. Create should only be used the first time quantities are being exported if a new quantity database is required. If one already exists, this should always be set to append. Keep in mind that append will not overwrite any existing data. If a particular pay item has changes or additions, the file will need to be opened in Quantity Manager, the incorrect data deleted, then that pay item may be recalculated and exported to the database. Naming a quantity run is not required, but can be used to differentiate between quantities calculated at different times in the project lifecycle. Setting the quantity groupings is a very important step. It's very important to change the selection in this box and do not use any of the name selections provided as default. The BOE Chapter 9 gives a full listing of the grouping codes that are appropriate for various pay item groups that are compatible with Ch4 project pre-construction. If you export values with the default names, when you get to the end of your project and you're exporting your Quantity Manager database to send to Project Pre-Construction, it will cause an error, and Project Pre-Construction will reject the entire database. At that point in your project, you definitely don't want to have to reprocess all your quantities into a new database, so be sure to highlight the selection and type in the correct code in this section before clicking the Export button. To the right of the Export button, there is a checkbox and button for Advanced Project Settings. It is not necessary to set this information at this step. Clicking the Display button will turn on and off the highlight of the items listed in the computation results. Once all the export settings are defined, clicking on the Export button will write the data to the quantity database. You can check the bottom left status bar in MicroStation to confirm the export is completed. Exercise 4.1. Calculating linear foot quantities with D&C Manager. In this exercise, we will use D&C Manager in the DSGN RD01 file to calculate linear foot quantities. Then we will review and export those quantity values into a Quantity Manager database. First, let's open MicroStation. In the Desktop folder, click on the FDOT SS4 icon and start MicroStation. Verify that you are in the Project Dataset folder and select DSGN RD01, then Open. Once the file opens, adjust the view as necessary. Following along with the exercise in the training guide, we'll open D&C Manager and expand the curb and gutter category. Keep the category as the active selection and set the mode to compute. This brings up the Plan Quantity Computation dialog and opens a collection bin at the bottom of the D&C dialog window. Let's check the settings here and verify that we have the correct job, extents, chain, stationing, and range. We'll need to change the range to 175 to match the training guide. Once all the settings match, we can click Compute Quantities. This brings up the Computation Results dialog. You can see that because we selected Curb and Gutter category, D&C found both the Type E and Type F curb and gutter that are drawn in the file. Notice too that in the Results section, there are checkboxes under the Export heading. You can check or uncheck these boxes to mark them to be included in the current export. Next, we'll make sure the export format is set to DBMS and type the project number in the box for the file name. 220-495-55201. Since this is the first time we've exported quantities for this project, we'll leave it set to Create. We don't need to fill in a run name, but we do need to fix the groupings. Because these pay items belong in the roadway category, the BOE specifies that the grouping should be 0200. We'll have to highlight and type that value in. Now we have all our settings correct, we can click Export. Double check in the bottom left status bar to verify that the export is complete. We can close the Computation Results dialog and look back for the next step in the training guide. Next, we need to select the guardrail category. Make sure to change the chain to BL98 in the Plan Quantity Computation dialog. Notice that the stationing changes with the chain. Then we can click Compute. D&C will find the length of guardrail that we placed in the previous exercise. Verify the settings and change the export format from Create to Append. Then click Export. Check the status bar to verify that the export was successful. Then close D&C and save settings. Now that we've covered how to quantify linear quantities, let's look at how to create our area shapes in our QTD-SRD file. D&C Manager has a shape tool provided, but we found that this particular tool does not work well with civil elements, especially civil cells. With that in mind, FDOT does not recommend using the D&C Shape tool for creating quantity shapes. We do need to create our shapes with the D&C attributes, though, so we recommend the use of the MicroStation Create Region tool with the selected D&C item active and Place Influence checked on. Within the Create Region tool, it is very important to keep the associative region boundary unchecked, or D&C will not recognize the shape to calculate. Another important consideration is to not use the Locate Interior Shapes options. This would create shapes with grouped holes, which causes errors in the stationing results in the calculations, so it's not recommended. Setting fill type and color is not required, but can assist in seeing which areas have shapes created. The view display can always be turned off for fill once all the shapes are created. Exercise 4.2. Calculating area quantities with D&C Manager. In this exercise, we will use our QTD-SRD file to create quantity shapes. Then we will compute and export area quantities to the Quantity Manager database. For this exercise, we'll need to open our QTD-SRD file. Go to File, Open, then select the QTD-SRD01 file and click Open. Make sure that you're in the model 334-152. We'll need to adjust our view so we can see the area we need to work in, so let's zoom to the intersection. To make it easier to work in this area, let's rotate the view to put the stationing running left to right. Use the Rotate View tool with a 2-point rotate. Then select 2 points along the station ticks that will give us a start and end point along the alignment. Select the snap at the base of the tick, then select the snap at the intersection of the next tick up station. Now that we have our view rotated, we need to adjust the information we see on the screen. To create our shapes, we only need to see the line work that defines the limits of the areas we want to quantify. To create our shapes in this exercise, we won't need to see the alignment or topo, so we can turn off the display of those references. Select the References tool to open the dialog, then uncheck the display options for the alignment and topo. That's cleaned up our view quite a bit, but our view is still quite busy with lines that we don't need to create our shapes. In this case, we're going to be placing asphalt shapes, so let's adjust our level view display to turn off the levels that we don't need. In the Level Display dialog, you'll want to select the reference for the design file, so that we can adjust the view of that reference. Also, we'll want to make sure that our level filter is set to all levels so that we can see all the levels that have been used in that file, so we can control them. You can adjust the order that the levels are listed in this view by clicking the name to sort alphabetically. Then click the Used header to group the levels that are actually used in the file. Following along in the training guide, we're directed to turn off all the levels, so right-click and select All Off. Then we'll turn back on the levels that we need to see for our shapes. Curb Back, Curb Face, Pavement Asphalt, pavement milling, shoulder paved, sidewalk back, sidewalk front, and traffic separator. Close the level display dialog and you can see that our view is much cleaner now. Next, let's open the D&C Manager and set the active item. Collapse the category for Plan Features and expand the category for Quantity Features. Navigate to the Asphaltic Concrete folder, then expand the Superpave Asphaltic Concrete folder. Make sure the Design tool is active, then we'll double-click the item for 334-152. By double-clicking, we've activated the Place Influence, and you can see the AdHoc attributes displayed. Next, we're going to draw some lines to form boundaries for our asphalt shapes. Following along with the training guide, in Step 7, let's zoom to the top of the intersection. Snap to the yellow curb back line, then you can use the perpendicular snap to connect to the milling line. Repeat the process at the bottom of the intersection. Snap to the center of the traffic separator, and then snap perpendicular to the milling line again. Next, we need to divide the island. You want to make sure to split any areas like this so you don't have any holes within your shape. You can create a shape with a hole in it, but D&C will not export the correct stationing for the shape if you have a grouped hole. Since I'm using AccuDraw, let's just draw a straight line up from the traffic separator, across the island, and beyond the sidewalk. We can then use our Trim Multiple tool to clip the line to the edge of pavement. Under Modify Element, select Trim Multiple, and you'll see 3 tools in the dialog. The center tool is Trim, so activate it, and then select the line you want to cut to. Left-click, then select the line you want to cut, and left-click it. Repeat this at the island. Left-click on the edge of the pavement line, then left-click again on the line in the middle of the island. Next, we'll create a section line at the end of the median. Draw a line to connect the ends of the edge of pavement lines. Then we'll use our Trim Multiple tool again. Except this time, we'll use the Extend tool. Select the outside edge of pavement, then left-click on the center line we just drew to extend it. Then select the opposite outside edge of pavement and extend to that line on that side. Now let's zoom to the other end of the median. We'll repeat the process by connecting the ends of the edge of pavement lines in the median. Then you can actually create a selection set of the outer edge pavement lines and use the Extend tool to click on each side of the median line. Right-click to clear the selection. Then we'll enclose the end of the intersection as shown in the training guide. Draw a line to connect the back of curb lines. Then draw a line from the center of the traffic separator perpendicular to the line we just drew. Make sure to go back and trim the end line to the edge of pavement so it doesn't overlap. If you have overlapping lines, the Create Region tool sometimes has problems finding the enclosed region. It's always a good idea to keep your lines neatly trimmed and touching where they should be. Now that we have our boundaries established, we can create our shapes. Make sure that D&C is still active on the 334-152 item, with Place Influence checked. In the AdHoc dialog, find the LOC description or location description row and type in the value column SR61. This will apply the value to all the shapes we place. Under the Drop Element tool, you'll find the Create Region tool. Select it and let's double check the settings. We can leave the fill to opaque and the associative region boundary is not checked. That's good. It's set to ignore interior shapes, and the gap and margin are okay. Make sure it's set to flood, and then we can start left-clicking in the areas we want to create our shapes. Left-click to highlight the area, then left-click again to accept for each shape. You need to make sure the entire area you want to flood is in the screen, or the Create Region Flood tool won't work. Now let's change the D&C mode to Compute. Make sure the settings are all correct: job, extents, chain. Make sure the range is set to 150 as shown in the training guide. If everything looks okay, click Compute Quantities. Notice that all our shapes highlighted, so we know that they're all included in the computation results. Verify that all the settings are correct and be sure it's set to Append. Then click the Export button. Make sure the status bar says Export Completed, then close D&C and save settings. Exercise 4.3, Modifying AdHocs with D&C Manager for Quantity Calculations. In this exercise, we will use the shapes created in the previous exercise and modify the AdHoc values. Then we'll open Quantity Manager to remove the quantities that were exported in the last exercise, so we can then export the corrected values back to Quantity Manager. Continuing from the previous exercise, verify that we're still in the 334-152 model. Then we can open the reference dialog and turn off the design reference so that all we have showing in our file are the shapes that we created in the last exercise. In the Quantities taskbar, we'll reopen D&C Manager and make sure that it's still expanded to the 334-152 item. If it wasn't already there, you could click the D&C ID button, then left-click on one of the shapes, and it would expand and open right to that item. Next, with the asphalt item active, we'll select the D&C Set icon. Notice that the dialog changes to the Set window. Make sure that the AdHoc attributes is checked on, and change the attach mode from Append to Replace. Since I double-clicked on the item in D&C, it reset the AdHocs to the default values, so we need to put the location description value back in as SR61. Since we're already editing the AdHoc screen, we can go ahead and jump ahead of the training guide and change the lift value to 2.5. For asphalt, the lift value represents the thickness of asphalt. Since the quantity is measured in tons, the thickness of the asphalt affects the quantity, so we need to make sure that we have that value set correctly. Now, jumping back to the step before in the training guide, we'll create a selection set of all the shapes in the file. Be careful when you're using Set command on a group of items. If any item has or needs a different AdHoc, using the Set command on a group will write the active AdHocs to the entire group and would clear any previous AdHocs. Only use Set on a group of elements if you're sure that the AdHocs on all of those elements will be identical. Once you have your selection, click the Set button. Next, we can switch D&C to Compute mode. Verify that all the settings in the Plan Quantity Computation dialog are correct, and you can even click Compute at this point. But remember that we can't export the values for these shapes yet. These shapes already have values assigned in the Quantity Manager database, and clicking Export here would not overwrite that data. So instead, we'll go to the Quantity Manager application first. On the FDOT Plans Development Quantities taskbar, click on the Open Quantity Manager icon to start the application. This opens outside of MicroStation in a new window. Select Project, Open, and you'll see the Connect to Database dialog. click the Search button and navigate to the MDB file that we've saved in the Project Roadway folder. Once the path is set, click on the Connect button and the database will open. We'll just take a quick look in the database here. We'll cover Quantity Manager in much more detail in the next module. The pay item tree is very similar to the format of the database listing in D&C. We'll need to expand the categories to find our asphalt quantities. Once we find that entry, we can right-click and select Delete to remove those items from the database. Click Yes to confirm the deletion. The changes are automatically saved, so we can close Quantity Manager. Back in MicroStation, we can now click Compute Quantities. Check the results and the settings and click the Export button. Check the status bar to confirm that the export is completed. Close D&C Manager and save settings. Let's look a little closer at what makes up an item in D&C Manager. To review or modify an item, you can either use the buttons that appear when Preferences is active in the D&C Manager toolbar, or you can right-click on any item in the database to choose an option for Review or Modify. You'll only want to modify an item in D&C if you are sure that a change needs to be made and it is in agreement with the Basis of Estimates manual or approved by the Estimates Office. If a pay item has changed, make sure you have the latest maintenance release of the FDOT SS4 software and update your project database if necessary. If changes are still required, only make the changes to the copy of the database that is saved to your project. In the Modify Item dialog, there are a lot of settings and definitions to consider. The item ID always must be a unique name. If the item is to be quantified as a pay item, then the item ID should match the pay item number in the Basis of Estimates format. That format is always 4 digits beginning with 0, followed by 3 digits, including spaces when necessary, followed by another 3 digits as spaces and numbers. For instance, in the example shown here, the item ID is entered as 0520 space 1 space 10. As we discussed in the previous module, only 3 of the 4 types are used by FDOT: default, drafting standards, and compute parameters. Only the compute parameters items can be used to export quantities, though the default items may be used to assign AdHocs that can be used in conjunction with compute parameters items to generate quantities. The description field should be completed with the full description of the pay item as it is shown in the Basis of Estimates manual. Double-clicking in the Placement field brings up the Set Feature dialog, which allows the symbology to be set for the item, and the class can be set based on how the item should display. Setting the attribute gives the element a unique identifying attribute. Quite often, these match the pay item number with dashes instead of spaces. Finally, the cell name and scale allow for a cell to be associated with the item and will allow it to be placed at the set scale with the attributes of the D&C item. Continuing looking at the Modify Item dialog, the Supplemental Search Criteria section allows the item to recognize and compute elements with other symbology in addition to the placement settings defined above. Key-in commands are actions defined to be executed when a D&C item is double-clicked within D&C Manager. These can include actions such as initiating placement of a line or cell, to defining the active angle, and many others. For more information about key-in commands, refer to the D&C Manager help files. As we discussed in the last module, AdHocs can be used to define a lot of information that can be included with an element. In the Modify Item dialog, These AdHocs can be modified, added, or deleted. To ensure changes are saved to the item, though, you have to select OK on the AdHoc dialog as well as OK on the Modify Item dialog. The Compute Parameters dialog defines how an item will be calculated. The computation method can be set to standard units, equation, or AdHoc attributes. FDOT no longer uses criteria files to define computation method. Equations are defined in the computation method box. AdHoc attribute grays out the option and forces the item to read the computation parameters from the AdHoc definitions. The standard units can be selected from a list by clicking on the magnifying glass. The standard unit values from this list may also be used to define AdHoc unit values. Rounding sets the precision of the values calculated. This precision is defined in the Basis of Estimates manual and is calculated to one additional significant digit. The string processing determines how the element's stationing is reported. See the D&C Manager help files for more details on this. The quantity factor applies a multiplier to the computed values. Finally, the quantity deductions can reduce a quantity by a certain amount when another element is detected, as we discussed earlier with inlets in curb and gutter. Exercise 4.4. Add an item to the D&C Manager. In this exercise, we will copy an existing pay item. Then we will modify that copy to create a new pay item and save the modified D&C Manager database to the Project SYMB folder. Continuing from the previous exercise, here we're going to be looking in the D&C Manager database. Click on the D&C icon in the Quantities taskbar. First, we'll need to make sure we're working in our project-specific saved database. So we'll go to File, Open, and navigate to the Project SYMB folder. Select the Project DDB file and click Open. Verify that the path now points to the Project DDB. Select the D&C Preferences icon to display those tools. Find the item for 520.1.10 under Curb and Gutter. Right-click and select Copy. In the Copy dialog, find the 520.1.10 item and highlight it. The copy will be placed directly below whatever item is highlighted in this screen. Click OK. Now we see a new copy of the item with a number incremented by 1. Double-click on the new item to open the Item Modify dialog. We'll change the last 3 digits in the item ID to 11. Make sure to keep the space between the 1 and the 11 to maintain the proper format. Then we'll modify the description to add the words variable height. Next, we'll change the last 2 digits of the attribute to 11. Verify that all the settings are correct. And click OK. Now we've added a new D&C item for a variable height type Curb and Gutter. Select File and Save. Now the modified database has been saved and will be delivered with our project. One very important thing to remember is once your shapes are created and your quantities are exported is to label all of the shapes with ID. Part of the data that is included in the summary of quantities is the area ID. To make sure that reviewers can compare the information in the summary tables with the shapes in our QTD-SRD file, we have a tool that will place these labels on each element. You can find this tool in the FDOT bar menu under Actions, Label Shapes with ID, or on the FDOT Plans Development Quantities taskbar with the Label Shapes with ID button. To create the labels for all of the shapes in the current model, you can create a selection set of all of the shapes. Activate the Label Shapes with ID dialog and adjust the symbology as necessary to make the labels clearly visible on the screen. Keep in mind that these labels do not print, so the text size may be adjusted to whatever looks good. Once you have the selection set and the dialog settings, just click Label Shapes, then review the results on the screen. Be sure to complete this process for each quantity shape model. Exercise 4.5, Label Areas. In this exercise, we will use the Label Shapes with ID tool to label the shapes in our QTD SRD file. Then we will review the results and use the MicroStation Find tool to view and zoom to the labels. For this exercise, we're going to continue in our asphalt shape file. On the Quantity taskbar, find the Label Shapes with ID button. On the dialog, check the settings. Let's change the text size to 0.2 to match the training guide. Next, we'll need to create a selection set to include all of our shapes. Once they're highlighted, we can click the Label Shapes button. Notice that the labels appear, but they're still hard to see. Let's make some adjustments to our view to make them easier to spot. First, let's set the view attributes to turn off the fill. Then we can set the drawing scale. Because the text is placed annotatively, we can adjust the scale to a planned scale size and the text will resize accordingly. 1 to 50 should be fine for this view. Notice that the labels all appear to be upside down. This is because the view is rotated. The text is placed based on true north. If we set the view rotation to unrotated, all the text will appear correctly. Let's make a note of one of the label numbers, 4850. We can use the Edit, Find Replace tool to locate this area ID, even if we don't know or remember where it is. Select Edit, Find Replace, then enter the number 4850 in the search bar. Notice the view options for Animate and Zoom are checked on. Click Find. The view zooms to the area and we can review that shape. Close the Find tool and click OK on the Search Dismiss dialog. Zoom to the extents of the file, then save settings. This is the end of Module 3. Next, continue to Module 4, Chapter 5, Quantity Manager.